in the studio, we have Lawrence Xu-Nan joining us, who is the Green Party MP for ethnic communities and education. So welcome, Lawrence. It's a pleasure
Uh,
to have you on the program.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Blake. Kia ora, Paul. Kia ora, Blake. Ko Lawrence Toki Inwa. My name is Lawrence Xu-Nan, and it's a real pleasure to be here with the two of you.
Thank you for joining us. Now, you're someone who obviously wears a lot of hats. I have to ask, as an Egyptologist, is one of those hats a leather fedora that comes with a whip?
Um, you know, interestingly, I got into Egyptology or kind of classical studies because a lot of people ask me, like it was the Indiana Jones that made you get into it. It's like, actually no. One of them is an 80s manga and anime series called Knights of the Zodiac or Saint Seiya. That was one of them, and I grew up with that particular manga. And then the second one is Xena.
Good choice.
Yeah.
Very good choice. Have you met Lucy? Because she's quite a bit of a fan of your party, as I understand it.
Yes, I have. And every time I meet her, I am like starstruck. Not only just because I'm like, oh my God, it's Xena, but also just the fact that she's such a warm and genuine person. And I remember talking to someone, I'm like, you're looking at one of the few people who's got a celestial body named after her.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That is
I
cool.
think it was asteroid, or it was something that was called Discordia, who is the Roman goddess of lawlessness.
That's impressive. That is very impressive. Uh, so, as like, I know we should be talking politics and all, but I'm very fascinated by this whole thing. How do you grow up in East Auckland and end up being like, yeah, this Egyptology is something I need to study? I can't imagine there's a lot of expertise in this country about that field.
Yeah, so University of Auckland is the only university in New Zealand that actually teaches Egyptology. And what happened was when I was going to university, I was in the first year. I was originally going to do sort of Chinese studies, but then that didn't quite work out. And I did classics at high school. And all of my friends, I had a very nerdy year in high school, and all of my close friends were like, "We're going to be doing this ancient Egyptian history paper, and you might as well just do it with us." Very much in like that meme from Mean Girls is like, get in losers, we're going to study Egyptology. Um, and then that's how I got into it, and I just sort of fell into it. And then I think with any like anyone, you have this fascination with ancient culture and growing up, and I was always really interested in the pyramids and mummies, and I started learning more about it. And in my second year, I started doing ancient Egyptian language, so Middle Egyptian and Egyptian hieroglyphs, and I really enjoyed that. I was really good at it as well, and that then kind of just carried on. And at university, classics, ancient history, we have such a close knitted like relationship with each other and within the student body, and it was just a really warm and inviting place to be in, and that kind of then meant that I just carried on until I finished my PhD in 2017.
And and then from there, how did you um, um, find yourself in the Green Party?
Well, going a little bit further back, I got into started becoming more interested in politics because throughout my university degrees, I actually wasn't very interested in politics at all because I was studying, it's a niche subject, and then we felt like, oh, this is not somewhere that's touchable and sort of beyond politics and all of these sort of things. And then I started seeing the impact of politics and of government budgets and etc. have on tertiary education, have on my very department, as we started seeing our funding reduce over the years, particularly during I think, under the key government. Um, and then that was a wake up call for me to realize just the impact that politics have on education and on tertiary education. So I kind of became more interested, but it wasn't until I finished my PhD and started working that I had more time on my hand. And I was in New Zealand for a lot longer, that I became a Green Party member and became more involved internally with Green Party politics, and I held various roles within the Green Party. And yeah, so most recently I had to step down as the party co-convener because I had a very fortunate opportunity to become one of the MPs for the Green Party, but also amidst really sad circumstances as well with the passing of Nana Efeso Collins.
I'm kind of curious, again, being completely nerdy here. You've got a whole bunch of Pratchett behind you. Um, is that your Pratchett or is that your flatmates?
So most of it is my flatmate, but this is really important to me. This is my favorite Pokemon, Ninetales, going back to Gen 1. So yeah, so this is mine. And then I've got, I think, a few bits and pieces that we use sometimes for D&D
Okay.
because we play a lot of D&D at home.
Okay. I was just thinking with the Pratchett stuff, I was wondering whether or not, with your time in Parliament, you've been able to sort of sit there and go, that's a veterinary, that's a Vimes, that's a Weatherwax, and see,
Yeah,
recognize those characteristics in people who actually make the decision-making process happen within Parliament.
yeah, absolutely. And I think my flatmate would be like she's a lot more into Terra Pratchett. I haven't actually read a lot of Terra Pratchett, but I have seen enough and heard enough to go like, you know, here is someone who's got an enormous knowledge and kind of infinite creativity when it comes to building and shaping a world and being able to tie sort of real life concepts. And I think most recently I was reading somewhere something about I can't remember the character's name, talking about essentially what capitalism is and
Oh,
how
about the
he
cost of boots.
explained it, yeah,
Yeah.
in this world. And it's amazing. And I think it's really accessible. And I think that also highlights once again the need for funding and the need for us to continuously promoting arts and humanities and create writing and all of those things that kind of allow us to basically like e- enjoy our lives. And yeah,
So you're talking about the Vimes boots paradox, where if you buy a cheap pair of boots, you'll keep buying cheap boots for years and years, and it'll end up costing you more than buying an expensive one that would last you for years. And it's a poverty cycle that seems to be making
yeah,
quite a few rounds at the moment, and it's a really easy,
yeah,
accessible way for people to see how people can be trapped in that poverty cycle. Um,
yeah,
love Pratchett's work; he's absolutely brilliant, or was absolutely
yes,
brilliant. When you're sitting there in Parliament and you're dealing with issues like ethnic communities and some of the ways that they get impacted, um,
hmm
do you find yourself sort of looking at the big picture, going, how do we fix these poverty cycles that might be impacting these ethnic communities or young people as they come through education? How does that change your perception to how you tackle the world?
I think with my portfolios, I've got six portfolios. I have education, ACC, and trade, and that's kind of on one side. And I kind of consider them as theme-based portfolios. And then I've got seniors, ethnic communities, and overseas New Zealanders. And those three are what I kind of, in my mind, place as more group-based portfolios. So it's basically every portfolio, when it comes to group-based portfolios, every portfolio needs to be consider their effect and their impact on these particular groups. And like you said, when we're looking at, let's say, ethnic communities, when we're talking about housing, how does that affect, ethnic communities? Has ethnic communities been considered or been consulted as a part of that? When we're talking about health, what does that mean for ethnic communities? And particularly for my background as a Chinese person in Aotearoa, what does that mean in terms of that? And also you get the intersectionality. What about ethnic elders, ethnic seniors? What does that mean when it comes to the support that we're meant to be doing for them? And I think, when we've been looking at particularly some of the things we've been talking about when it comes to disability issues, um, nothing about us without us, I think, is really pertinent when we're talking about all of these sort of different groups and how we can ensure that any policies and law or etc., even though we're in opposition, we're able to challenge the government on the decisions that they make that affects all of these different groups.
You bring up a really good point, because I was just saying to Paul before we went on this call this morning about the nothing else talk about a kind of thing. It's up until now I hadn't really been affected by the cutting, but sort of in the last few days it started to really affect me as well. So in your community, how much impact are you seeing of these disability cuts in your local community as a local MP, Lawrence?
Yeah, I think specifically in my kind of portfolio area, particularly when it comes to education, one of the key things that we're seeing is just the lack of funding when it comes to support staff, the difficulties that people have when it comes to getting ORS funding, and the ongoing resource scheme from the Ministry of Education. Um, and I think one of the things that recently we've been working on and then been thinking a lot about is sort of the resource that is needed from a ECE perspective, early childhood education perspective, for students with additional needs. One of the issues that we're currently facing when it comes to ECE is the fact that the current government want to see more and more privatization of ECE centers, which means that they are going to put profit over people and over our young people and our children. And we've heard stories from parents with children and with needs. I think I was talking to someone whose daughter has a genetic disorder that's very similar to palsy, and he was rejected from a number of ECE centers because they're like, we just don't have the skills or capacity to deal with them, and now has managed to finally found one for his daughter, but then that's ages away from where they are. So every day he has to travel by car for like up to 30 minutes to try and just to send his daughter to a EC center, and that shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen in Aotearoa, and I think that's not how we look after our people.
You bring up a really good point, because the minister would just, the acting minister, beg your pardon, was just saying in recent days that no cuts have been made. Her and the current minister keeps saying cuts haven't been made. They're not effective, but clearly there's something not aligning here, because people are being affected every day. So I'm really disappointed as a disability advocate myself that our own disability ministers seem to be misleading us in the House.
You're absolutely right, Blake. And I think two additional things is, even if they continually say no cuts has been made, which is incorrect, we've are decades behind the funding that is needed. So it's, even if you didn't make any cuts, it's actually not good enough anymore. We need to have a lot more funding in all different aspects for the disabled communities. But the other thing that's also really important, when it comes to just decisions that's being made, is what we're finding is that agencies and departments don't necessarily talk to each other in terms of when they do make a decision. Because one of the things, if I don't know if you explored it previously, is that they were saying that some of the additional funding that is was available for disabled students were no longer available for students during school hours because like some of the extracurriculum stuff. And we actually asked the Ministry of Education about this. This is after it's been in the news, and we asked the Ministry of Education, what do you think about this? And they're like, oh, we didn't know this was happening. And I'm like, did not only did no one talk to you about it before a decision was made, it's already been in the news, and you're not even aware of something that is within your portfolio. Um, yeah, so those kind of things is also what I've been finding in my short time in Parliament quite apparent, is that departments and etc. were a lot more siloed than I thought they were. And there's not as much collaboration or cooperation between some of the bigger departments.
That's actually really horrifying.
We talk a lot about education, and in recent days, you've been a part of a bill that um, is making some adjustments, and you've been really passionate about this. So, can you talk a bit to us about your mindset around that and why you're so passionate in the House about, some of these subjects that are going around at the moment?
Yeah. So, um, I guess I'm really passionate from two perspectives. Number one, the topic itself. So the bill that is being referred to is the Education and Training Amendment Bill, which looks like the two big part is the reintroduction of charter schools, and the second part is the repeal of the network management approval process for ECE centers, which basically means that it's much easier for private companies to set up ECE centers. Um, and I think when we're looking at the charter schools, the big thing there is the fact that we are putting in a lot of money, $153 million for the setup of a system that we don't really need because our system's already incredibly flexible and there's a lot of choices already for parents in terms of where they send their children. So, for example, we've got state schools, state integrated schools, state specialist schools, special character schools, kaupapa, private schools. So, you already have that flexibility. You don't need to reintroduce yet another thing with a completely separate department and separate protocol. At this particular junction and this particular time. Um, so that's one of the area I found, really, really disheartening in terms of the money that could have been put into other areas. We've seen a lot of cuts in other areas as well, such as creatives in schools, which was really helpful and it's building confidence, building a love of learning for the students. Because I mean, I think that's what it is. Education is a journey, it's not a destination, but the government is treating it as a means to an end and a means for you to get a job and and all of those little things. Um, so that's one element. And I think the other element that I found really disheartening and what makes me really angry was the fact that the process of all of the things, the fact that the government is putting in amendment papers without any consideration for submitters, and I think, and also when we're looking at the select committee, um, the fact that 90.3% of people who submitted opposed charter schools, 96.3% of the people who submitted opposed the repeal of the network management. That's not some submitters, that's almost all submitters opposed it. And it's just none of that, and just as a bill, because all select committees, except for two, I think, has government majority, it means they can just push through any bill without really taking on board what the submitters and what the public um, has feed in, taken out of their time and their busy day to make a submission, to make an oral submission. And I think that was really got me frustrated. Is this is not how democracy should work. This is not what I mean when we want to hear from the people should work. Yeah, so I was really angry at on the submitter's behalf.
Before I hand back to Paul, I've just got two more education type ethnic questions. So we spoke to Jan Tinetti a few weeks ago here on the program, and she said that if the Labor government would return to power in 26 or beyond, they would immediately abolish charter schools. Would you support that personally or as a party?
We would definitely support that, but then obviously with some caveats, which is when we're looking at education, we do put the students and the teachers sort of at the forefront as well. So with that, and I'm sure that Jen would agree as well, is yes, we don't think the charter school model is a model that's going to work, but we're also going to have to be working with those students, working with the whānau, working with the school, the teachers, etc., to say what is the best way forward. And I know in the previous iteration, a lot of that, the charter school then became, I think, state integrated schools. Um, So that is always an option as well. But fundamentally, for those schools who are choosing to convert, and we're not talking about new schools, because a lot of the new schools that's coming in are done by for-profit companies, and the idea is that some of them are coming from overseas. They can convert to a private training establishment or a private school if they wish. But the focus here is a lot of the converting schools. It's also looking at the root cause of why those schools choose to convert in the first place. Is it because that our current education system has not served them well? How can we improve our education system? How can we ensure there is sufficient funding that these schools don't have to scrape, the bottom of the barrel, have to go through, like in terms of some of the funding that's needed for teaching assistant, and like I mentioned before, in terms of the ORS funding, how do we make sure that it's more user friendly for the schools and the communities?
Yeah, you're talking about the bottom of the barrel. So, how are you concerned in terms of the ethnic community and poverty perspective that they might start targeting stuff like breakfast in schools and stuff like that? And if that were to be the case, how detrimental could it be to a community like yours?
Yeah, I think it would be really harmful. It would be really hurtful for a lot of the communities, and particularly when it comes to sort of ethnic communities and migrant communities. But I think in terms of the migrant community, the ethnic community portfolio, one of the big focus I have, and of course education is one part of it, but one of the things that I really want to focus on this term is around health, and particularly around mental health and trauma. I think one of the things, coming from my own personal background, as a Chinese person, Chinese families are already very conscious and very aware of educational needs for their children. So it's not something that I feel like I need to sort of create, like not really reintroduce, but also sort of talk about some of the harder conversations. I think one of the hardest conversations that we need to have within that ethnic communities portfolio is the fact that migrant communities, and I'm using Chinese community as example, aren't very good at talking about mental health, aren't very good at talking about disability, aren't very good at talking about domestic and sexual violence and family trauma, because we just assume that that's normal, or like, oh well, we make excuses for that. So I think that's an area that I'm really really keen to sort of highlight and do some work around.
No, I've actually got it might be a bit of a tricky question for you on this one around migrant communities. And it involves David Seymour, so it's already going to suck. He's obviously pushing at the moment for the introduction of his treaty principles bill. The worst people on the internet are really good at pointing out that the treaty is a contract between Maori and the Crown, and often bring up the inclusion and growing migrant communities that we have in this country as a reason why we need to define these treaty principles. I'm kind of curious as to what your perspective on that is, as both somebody who is part of a migrant community, but also somebody who's a spokesperson on behalf of one of the opposition parties, around how that kind of framing could harm or help the bill.
So one of the things that we see, and like you said, from the more sort of unscrupulous online actors, when it comes to the treaty, when it comes to Titility or any discussions around Titility or Maori relations, is a divide and conquer mentality. And we're looking at the fact that when I'm talking to Chinese media, there's a particular proverb that I would like to use, which is 鹬蚌相争，渔翁得利, which means when the clam and crane fight, the fisherman is the one that benefits. So very much that kind of divide and conquer term as well. And the reason for this, so there are a couple of things. It's number one, by sowing that discourse, we don't address the real issue here, which is the fact that the indigenous people of Aotearoa has been for centuries has been colonized and has had their tongue, their culture, their kaupapa, tikanga, etc., removed and attempted to be erased by the crown. Um, I think from a migrant community, one of the things is, like with any other country you go to, when you go to a particular country, you recognize and honor the sort of the contract and some of these agreements, understand some of these fundamental documents. You know, just because there's going to be lots of migrants in the US, it doesn't mean that the migrants going to be like, oh yeah, we can now change your constitution, because this is really, really important. So I think that is a red herring of a tactic for people to go, like, oh, migrants, should really weigh in. I think as a migrant, I come here and then I'll be like, look, here is the contract, and you know, in this case, both parties supposedly has invited us as migrants to their country, and we know we're going to be looked after by the parties. And and I think that's where the angle really is how do we then highlight and how do we build on top of our understanding of utility by engaging with the indigenous people. And I think the idea is like, oh, migrants needs to have a say. Migrants needs to be having a say, but also being able to hear from Mali and be able to build that relationship with Mali. To be fair, Chinese people have had relationships with Mali going back to the 1800s. We're looking at when the first wave of Chinese migrants came here, as during the mining rush. It wasn't the Pakeha who looked after the Chinese. Yeah, they took the money with the head poll tax and everything, but it was the interaction with Mali, because there was compatibility between the two cultures. And I think, that is something that we also need to remember as well. So no, I reject this discourse that, like we need to look at the treaty principles bill because of the fact that, we have more migrants here. And, well, we can learn and understand Hefakaputanga better. We can learn and understand utility better in the context in which it was said. We don't need to have a treaty principles bill to define things.
That is brilliant. I keep forgetting, and it's my own fault. I do keep forgetting about the impact that the Chinese communities made during the gold rush. It's absolutely massive. Yeah, it was sort of the cornerstone of the South Island economy for a very long time there. Yeah, we've got a long history of that in this country.
Yeah, it's not just the South Island. You're looking at, like, for example, in Taranaki, when it comes to Taranaki black gold and Chuchon and his family, when we're looking at some of the work that Joe and Fei Gok did in terms of revitalizing Kumara in Tamakimakoto, like there's all of these stories of really beautiful interactions, and Manga Kiekia as well, all of these really beautiful interactions between Chinese people and Chinese migrants and Tangata Whenua and Mana Whenua. And I think, that's the kind of thing we're looking at when we're talking about Kotaki Tonga. We're looking at what unity means, not this divisive discourse that we've been thrusted upon by one person.
He does seem very determined, despite all of the objections from everybody. Is it something that you guys are preparing for as a party? Taking the battle out there, knowing that it's going to stir up a whole bunch of bullshit from a whole bunch of shitheads.
Absolutely. And I think it's when we're looking at utility being under attack, we're looking at it as Tonga utility, we're looking at it from a lot of different perspectives. So one of the things that we're looking at currently is, I don't know if you two are aware that um, the Minister of Education has sort of sneakily put in a consultation document to deprioritize giving effect to utility and also the teaching of Tikanga Māori and Te Reo Māori in schools in the Education and Training Act. That is Section 127 of the Education and Training Act. And currently there are four primary objectives, and they're going to remove two and deprioritize utility and only keep educational outcome as one, which means that if the school deems that utility, giving effect to utility is not going to be conducive, or it's going to be, they don't have the capacity to do that to be in line with the singular primary objective of educational outcome, they don't have to give effect to utility. And I think that's really, really concerning and really harmful as we're going into Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori starting, I think, starting tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I was actually wondering, and this is probably incredibly nerdy and very niche. When it comes to your role in Parliament, how much of that do you sit there going, well, look, this is something that we learned about in Egyptology. This is something that we saw during, I don't know, the Second Dynasty, for example, that relates directly back to something like this that people don't even realize because Egyptology is a field that's obviously very niche, but we keep repeating mistakes and we need to learn from history.
Yes. I think one of the most amazing thing about learning ancient history is that it really humbles you because you realize that, yes, we have all of these amazing inventions like, like smartphones and all of that, but imagine inventing smartphone, imagine inventing like the foundation of mathematics. Um, so for me, it was a humbling experience to learn about what ancient cultures and ancient people were up to, but also a way of humanizing them as well. Like these are genuine people with emotions and feelings and family. Um, so definitely when I'm in the house, there are a couple of things. Number one is I've started to increasingly kind of make classical and historical references. I think the first reading of the Education and Training Amendment Bill was talking about Chimera and Bellerophon. Um, and, you know, also, the other element is when it comes to ancient culture, a lot of that is done through orality, and the mastery of oral delivery is really, really important. So, through my studies, particularly when it comes to language and literature, you learn about, well, my thesis was about how to tell a story in a really interesting way. So, at the same time, when you're in the house or when you're giving a speech, how do you make that interesting? What do you use to sort of draw people's attention? How do you relate to people? So a lot of the things when it comes to talking is about relationship and then building on that relationship. So that is something I've drawn from my thesis. Um, One particular story that I like to tell, particularly from ancient Egypt, is around just how advanced they are when it comes to their legal system and their law in some ways. And this is a story, and this is a papyrus we have from the 18th, 19th dynasty, which is, oh, we don't actually use dates in Egyptology. We use dynasties. So I think it's probably around 1200 BC, maybe a little bit earlier than that. But it's a will. It's a papyrus with a will from a lady called Nanokta. And the will of Nanokta is among many. It's a really important piece of finding because it talks about the fact that she has or she has children and she's leaving them a will. She has disinherited, I think, three of her youngest children because they didn't look after her in her old age. She has given an extra bronze bowl to her eldest child because he did look after her at her old age. Um, but what's really important about this piece and our understanding of the legal and societal context of ancient Egypt was number one, they have wills. Number two, the wills were witnessed by and signed by witnesses. So that is something we continues to do this day with will. Um, it talks a little bit about the context and the culture of looking after your elders and the importance of looking after elders, which is something that they also hold to a very high regard. And the most important thing is she said that although she disowned, I think, three of her children, it did not preclude them from gaining inheritance from their father. So what we are looking at is individual ownership and then also ownership and property rights for women back at that stage, which is not something we've seen for a long time later on. And I think, putting all of these together, we're still very much learning about some of the conducts and some of the worldview of ancient people, ancient Egyptians or anyone else. And so, and we're still learning a lot about that. And I thought that was a really, really cool story.
Mm, that is a very cool story. It's brilliant. Well, what is the biggest misconception that people have about studying Egyptology other than the Indiana Jones thing?
Other than the Indiana Jones thing, I mean, a lot of the stories of there are a lot of things we often get is, so
Let me
how can
guess.
you prove that the pyramids weren't built by aliens?
Mhm.
Um,
That was what I was going to say. I thought it'd be something to
and
do with aliens.
um, yep, yep, and we do get a fair bit of that. And but I think it's just so I used to teach and tutor some of the Stage 1 courses and used to lecture and tutor Egyptian language as well at university. And I think one of the things that catch people by surprise is they sort of start the course expecting that we're just going to be moving, watching the mummy movies or Indiana Jones, and then we started going like, okay, here is the king list. You need to learn the king list because it's really important. And they're like, I don't understand any of these names, and you're just throwing things like Hasakemwi and Joser and Menkare and like Hatshepsut at me, and I don't know what any of them means. So they are confronted by just how much knowledge there are and how much information there are when it comes to ancient Egypt. And on the other hand, when we're looking at the language, it also catches people by surprise just how sophisticated their language is. Um, and also, I think when I was teaching, just catches me by surprise just how little we now know about sort of grammar and people forget what a noun is and what a verb is, how they are used in a sentence. So you have to unpack all of that before you're going like, now let's talk about infinitives, let's talk about gerunds, let's talk about pluperfects. So being able to use language teaching as a way of getting students to also engage in their primary language and in their mother tongue, in predominantly in English, is also really fun because you started seeing people going like, that's why I say that in English. It never occurred to me because it's just something really natural. It's like, oh, well, now you know.
All right, I have one final nerdy question before I hand everything over to Blake to sign over. I remember seeing a documentary not that long ago about language. That is still, I think, only one term or one word that's used from ancient Egypt. From like they're able to track it back through there. And I think it's the number three, or it's a really basic sound that gets used in almost every language to mean the same thing. And I'm just wondering how accurate that is, or was this just a piece of bullshit that I might have been watching at 2 o'clock in the morning that I should have probably been sleeping through?
I am not aware of that particular one, but the example that I do normally give is often the word for mother and father, particularly for mother, the sound, because it's one of the first sound I think a child makes. You will find that in most cultures, even in ancient cultures, that the word for mother often start with an M. So like in English, in anywhere like mama or etc. And in ancient Egyptian, it was mut. Um, so like you do get that M reoccurring M sound across different cultures when it comes to the word for mother.
That is fantastic. Oh, I feel so much smarter now.
Hey, well, thanks for joining us today on the show, Lauren. Um, it's been a real pleasure. Bit of a history lesson for me because I haven't been in school for so many years. So nice to hear about some Egyptology and history, and the work that you do is so valuable to your ethnic community. So it's been a real pleasure listening to you on the show. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no, thank you, Blake. Thank you, Paul. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and I don't get to talk about Egyptology enough now. So any opportunity I can get to talk about Egyptology, I will.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right.